Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you and welcome to this Royal Agricultural Society of England's webinar, part of the Farm of the Future webinar series. My name is Aaron Redman. I'm the Natural Resources Advisor at Innovation for Agriculture, and we shall be discussing the topic securing an income from restoring biodiversity loss. Could I remind everyone who's attending on this webinar that you can use the Q&A tab at the bottom to post any questions that you might have as we introduce today's speakers. With me online are 4 specialists on this topic, acting at different levels of the industry. We have Dr. Nick White, who serves as Principal Advisor for Net Gain at Natural England, leading efforts on Biodiversity Net Gain, driving its implementation in town and country planning and shaping its role in major infrastructure projects. His expertise spans legislation, biodiversity metrics, and development of standards, placing him at the forefront of sustainable planning. He's a strong advocate for social economic benefits of biodiversity. Nick also focuses on green infrastructure and its role in boosting urban resilience, recognized on the ENDS report as the top 100 environmental professionals list for 3 consecutive years. He offers both expertise and practical solutions to the modern planning challenges. Then, as Chief Ecology Officer at the Environment Bank, we have Emma Tuvey, who leads a team of ecological and environmental management specialists, ensuring technical excellence across the company's pioneering habitat bank projects, championing high-quality nature restoration. As a key figure in developing biodiversity net gain products, Emma also spearheaded the launch of the Nature Shares, enabling impactful corporate investment in nature. With over 20 years of ecological consultancy experience, she is a trusted expert in sustainable environmental solutions. Our third speaker today is Poppy Shearborn, Countryside Advisor at the National Farmers Union, specializing in environmental policy for agri-environment schemes, biodiversity, trees, species, and protected landscapes. She works closely with farmers, growers, and key stakeholders like DEFRA and the RPA, ensuring policy changes are practical and effective. With 3 years at the NFU and also BASIS certification, Poppy is passionate about making environmental policy work for farming businesses whilst addressing the challenges farmers face. Last but certainly not least, I have the pleasure of introducing Harvey Davies from Thrings Solicitors, who combines his experience managing family farm in Herefordshire with his role as a lawyer in the planning environment team at Thrings Solicitors, where he leads the firm's natural capital practice. With a unique matrix of legal business expertise, Harvey advises clients on emerging natural capital markets, helping them develop innovative, profitable solutions to improve the environment. Passionate about supporting farmers and land managers, he works to ensure they navigate opportunities and challenges to achieve the best commercial outcomes. So I'll just remind you all today to please put any questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom. That's the square bubble with the question mark in it. And then if you do put anything in the chat, we'll try and transfer that over, but it does make it easier if it's in the Q&A tab. So today we're here to discuss how rejuvenating and supporting biodiversity within our landscape might make and provide a financial opportunity to farmers and land managers in the UK. So to kick us off and set the scene, we'll start with Nick from Natural England.
Many thanks. Thanks indeed, Aaron, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. And as Aaron said, my name's Nick. I kind of lead on Net Gain on behalf of Natural England. And what I wanted to do, just in a kind of through a short presentation, is just to set out a little bit about what is Biodiversity Net Gain, what's the legislation covering, and then its potential relevance to yourselves as landowners and land managers as well. And then Emma, I'm sure, will go into some more detail around aspects of that after me. So just to kick off, firstly, what Biodiversity Net Gain is trying to do is essentially three things. It's trying to change the way that development thinks about nature. So it's looking to try and we're in a nature crisis in this country. So it's trying through planning policy to further reinforce the mitigation hierarchy to make sure that nature is better considered within the planning process, but also, and importantly, to contribute towards nature recovery as well, to make sure that we're providing habitats in local places where they're most needed and where they can add most value to the natural environment. Secondly, it's also trying to provide benefits to people, recognizing that having contact with the natural environment has many proven kind of benefits to our health and well-being, but also recognizing that through creating habitats that themselves can also help with mitigating against flood risk and providing kind of other wider environmental benefits as well to places and communities. And then thirdly, it's also looking to try and kind of streamline the development process itself, kind of embed nature in it to make developments more sustainable, but lead to a more objective mechanism as well. So this is all kind of wrapped up and set out in the 2021 Environment Act. So this is the kind of legal vehicle that brings Biodiversity Net Gain into play. So although the legislation covers many different bits of the UK, for Biodiversity Net Gain, we're talking about England only. So this only applies in England. And what it did is have the effect of starting to change two existing pieces of legislation. So earlier this year, it began to have an effect on the Town and Country Planning Act. So in February, Biodiversity Net Gain became a legal requirement for major developments under the Town and Country Planning Act and was extended to minors in April. And it's expected to extend further to projects consented under the 2008 Planning Act, which to you and I are nationally significant infrastructure projects, and that's due to come in stream in 2025 at the end of. And what it means is that all projects that are covered by the legislation, there are some exemptions, but all that are covered have to do a minimum 10% biodiversity gain as calculated using a standardized biodiversity metric and through the approval of a game plan. And in doing that, they need to make sure that the biodiversity improvements they're providing, so the habitats they're creating or enhancements, are secured and managed for at least 30 years. Different ways of those outcomes being delivered, which I'll touch on. It also sees the establishment of a new national net gain register, which I'll also talk about. But importantly, this is new. So this isn't replacing any existing kind of environmental protections or legislation. This is additional too. So the way Biodiversity Net Gain works is it starts with an emphasis for the developer on trying to achieve biodiversity gain within their existing development site. So that's within the red line boundary. And that would be through improved quality landscaping, for example. But it also recognises that there'll also be circumstances where either practically that's not possible because of the nature of development, and importantly, there may be ecological reasons as to why that's not sensible either. There may be habitats and species you're trying to help meet the needs of, which trying to do that on sites where people and their pets are surrounding you isn't necessarily going to be a good outcome. In which case you can go off-site and a developer can look to make good the shortfall of biodiversity units to meet their net gain requirements through the purchase of off-site units from other landowners, other providers. It could be yourselves, it could be environmental NGOs, it could be anyone that can get their land onto a national net gain register, which I'll touch on. There is and you can do those two things in combination. There is a final option of last resort, which is the purchase of statutory biodiversity credits. We're trying to encourage everyone to avoid that option. It is a very expensive way of doing it. And that's essentially where developers buy our credits from government, who will then invest it in landscape scale recovery. But the intention is to try not get that money to government, but to get that invested into kind of landowners, land managers on the ground. So anyone who is looking to try and provide kind of biodiversity gains to developers who are having to go off-site needs to get their land onto a national net gain register. and a planning authority cannot approve a biodiversity gain plan, and a developer needs to get that game plan approved until they can legally commence their development. Planning authority can't approve that unless this gain has been registered and then allocated to that development on this register. So what it's there for is it's to provide means of introducing transparency into the net gain system, so it enables anyone to see where gains are being delivered off-site, who owns the land, what's being proposed, what's the management plan proposed, etc. But also to make sure that there's integrity to the system as well, so that the same kind of positive outcomes for nature aren't being sold to multiple different developments. And so keeping everyone quite honest in that. And there are various requirements that a landowner needs to meet to get onto this landowner, which are principally you need to have ownership of or the rights to the land. There needs to be a legal agreement in place, which is either a Section 106 agreement or a conservation covenant to set out how the land is going to be managed and your obligations as a landowner under that. And there also needs to be a kind of land charge on the land register. But once you're on there, then you've got units that potentially are available for developers to buy from you as well and get those allocated. Biodiversity net gain, it's kind of the clues in the net, is about kind of measuring change as well. So the biodiversity metric that everyone legally has to use is an important component of biodiversity net gain. It's not the be all end all, but it's an important part, because what it does is it uses it's the mechanism by which one calculates the baseline of a site, both the development site itself, but also the baseline of any kind of off-site land that's looking to sell units into this market, and then calculates and forecasts by you describing to it the type of habitats you're going to create or enhance, whether or not the overall percentage gain requirement has been met. So it is an important component. And although we all recognize that nature is very, very complicated and very complex, but the metric tries to stay quite simple. If you try to measure all aspects of nature, you'd be measuring for eternity potentially. So it eventually uses habitats as a proxy measure for nature. So it's trying to stay as simple as possible, but still being kind of robust, evidence-based. And it's a metric that's been now it's in legislation. It's been published by government, but it's freely available to use. And it's designed for use in a whole raft of different scenarios as well. So it's intended for use for big new kind of garden towns and villages, for example, new urban interventions, major infrastructure projects. But from a landowner's perspective, it's also the metric that we're being used to kind of baseline to say what's the current value of your land and how, through a change of management, introduction of new habitats, could you increase the biodiversity value of that land and therefore have units available to sell from developers. So it's a metric, it's a single metric, and it's one that everyone in England is using. So what does this mean for landowners? And as I said, you'll hear more about this from Emma. But essentially, this is opening up a new income stream opportunity for landowners, and that's both farmers, but potentially also local authority, parks and green space managers, and anyone that's got land that has the potential to get their land onto this national register. Developers that need to go off-site, that can't deliver the gains fully on-site, will be needing to pay for at least 30 years worth of management. And that's a negotiation. There's no fixed prices on this. This is down to individual landowners to negotiate, and to negotiate on the basis of full cost recovery, making sure all your costs, your overheads are included in that as well. The slide's actually slightly out of date, but on the slide I've put this 33 net gain sites now registered. It's actually now up to 37 sites, so it's increasing kind of daily. And the image on the screen, that's a family of farmers in just outside Wigan in Lancashire. Up until quite recently, they were farming the land for potatoes, but the area they were farming on was prone to subsidence. It's on a former coal field and also prone to flooding. And the farm was becoming increasingly uneconomic and non-viable from a commercial perspective. So rather than farming for potatoes, they're now farming for nature. They're creating habitats to deliver improvements for Greater Manchester. And you've got options as landowners, and Emma will go into this more, but around you can either create habitats early and potentially generate more units for sale, or you can wait until you've actually got a contract in place with a landowner. But one key thing to take home and to bear in mind, and you'll probably hear more of this over the course of the presentation, is understanding what the market needs as well, and making sure that what you're looking to try and provide is actually what is in demand in an area, and ensuring that you've understood your costs and are kind of recovering those as well. But that's just a very quick kind of overview of the legislation. So I will stop here and hand back to Aaron and then Emma.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was really, really good to set the scene and get everyone up to the same line. So we now have Emma Tuvey from the Environment Bank. And Emma, can you walk us through what Biodiversity Net Gain looks like in practice and share your insights on how this crucial topic will evolve in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me okay?
I can indeed.
Brilliant. Okay, and I'm sharing my slides, I believe. So that's great. Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm Emma Tuvey. I'm a Chief Ecology Officer. So I'm basically a trained ecologist and specialist in biodiversity net gain. As a business, we're an off-site biodiversity net gain operator. And essentially what that means is that we're a nature restoration business, and we have 30 projects live at the moment all over the country, and we're working really closely with landowners and land managers on bringing those sites forward and delivering tangible actions on the ground right now for nature. So what I've sort of touched, Nick's already touched on this to a degree, but I just wanted to explain sort of where an operator like us sits and where the opportunity for landowners really comes in. As Nick's already said, developers, first of all, they look to maximize any opportunity that they can, realistically taking into account the ecological kind of outcomes on site, but they'll do as much as they can on site as possible. But the reality is, in many circumstances, they need some kind of off-site solution, and they can deliver that in a number of ways. Where we sit at Environment Bank, we're a habitat bank provider, but there are actually a whole range of ways that landowners can actually get involved. So this is a really simple and basic model, and it kind of talks through. I'll just talk through three indicative options for landowners, but really it's a spectrum, and there's a whole range of differences in terms of commercial outcomes for landowners. There's differences in where the liability sits for landowners, difference in governance structures, and in particular different levels of technical, legal, tax, sales, and planning support that could wrap around each of these different models. So I think Harvey's going to talk a little bit later on all of a number of these that you'll need to be thinking about if you are interested in getting involved in BNG. But if I just talk through these at a very high level, do it yourself, it says what it is on the tin. A lot of landowners that have a high appetite for risk, and they also feel that they have a level of competence in delivering nature restoration projects on the ground. Perhaps you have expertise in-house, or you have a great network of support. Lots of landowners are choosing to deliver biodiversity net gain projects off-site themselves. Now, that means, of course, the financial risk sits with the landowner, but and often there can be, not always, but there can be a bigger reward financially as a result of this, because bigger risk, bigger reward. This is where landowners can also negotiate directly with developers, and that might be a bespoke solution for a developer, or indeed it could be a bigger, larger scale habitat bank that's kicked off with an initial transaction with a developer that can also then support other developers with purchases of biodiversity units. Kind of next on the scale, I'll just touch on here, is there are quite a lot of emerging other operators or intermediaries in the market at the moment, and they can offer a level of expertise and support. I think it's really important to note that Biodiversity Net Gain and this new market isn't just an ecology issue. It's a really multidisciplinary market and subject area that landowners, need to get their heads around if they want to get involved. It needs a lot of support and advice, both on the ecology side, but I sort of touched on their legal and tax advice and planning advice, understanding what developers need. All of this needs a level of expertise wrapped around it, and a joint venture partnership can offer that. It can offer a sort of supporting framework that landowners can work jointly with an intermediary to provide that support. And then, of course, there's a commercial arrangement that shares out the revenue opportunity there. The lowest risk model, a model like ours, is where a landowner can enter into agreement, a lease model agreement, for example, where a landowner can enter that agreement. They get a guaranteed from day one, a guaranteed level of income from the rental and a guaranteed level of income from land management services, essentially being stewards of the land and looking after the land. And that is guaranteed from day one, irrelevant of any sales happening. The landowner doesn't need to get involved in any of the governance, any of the legal challenges, getting on the gain site register, dealing with developers. That's all taken out of their hands, and they are just securing a level of income consistently over the course of the 33 years. There are different models in between, but those are kind of broadly the kinds of things that are happening in the market at the moment. So what does good look like? What does a habitat bank look like, and what does a BNG project look like? Back to the ecology, I think in the main, it's broadly seen that larger scale, landscape scale projects for nature recovery, as big as you can get to meaningfully deliver nature outcomes on projects, is the best thing that we can offer. So piecemeal, very small scale biodiversity net gain projects often aren't particularly commercially exciting for landowners. They're also more difficult to negotiate for developers, and certainly from an ecology perspective, they don't always deliver the best outcomes for nature. So something that's of a meaningful scale is usually the option that's opted for. The market currently, as it stands, if you can imagine where developers develop land, there's quite specific requirements in terms of what types of habitats they're impacting, and therefore what types of habitats they need to offset through these off-site provisions. So it's not just one habitat type. Typically on a project off-site, you'll get a range, a mosaic of habitats that we're trying to deliver, not only to meet the needs of the market, but also to work with the land. And that's the most important. I'm an ecologist. It's really important that projects are designed to do on the land what the land wants to do, rather than us kind of micromanaging what the land wants to do. So lots of our projects, and I'll show you another one in a moment, they are typically species-rich grassland, woodland enhancements and woodland creation, wetlands, but particularly lots of ponds, maybe some reed beds, and scrub. Definitely some scrub. It's perhaps one of the habitats that we don't typically see very much in our countryside, but we're designing quite a lot of natural scrub regeneration into these projects. We take account of the local conditions, what the local priorities are for nature recovery, and perhaps what species are at risk in a local area, and we think about the habitats that can help support those species. And really crucially, we always work with the landowners and land managers on what's actually deliverable and achievable on the land. So that's what a good project should look like. I've sort of touched on these already. Essentially, what a habitat bank is doing is delivering an uplift in biodiversity, and we use the biodiversity metric that Nick's talked about already. to calculate essentially how much biodiversity each project is delivering. That can then be translated in what's called a biodiversity unit, and then that's the bit that's sold on to developers, and they can input that into their own metrics to net out whether or not they've met their planning requirements. On habitat banks where they're forward funded, essentially what you're doing is you're doing something at landscape scale. This is what at Environment Bank we do. We forward fund all of the projects from day one, and that we deliver the uplifts in advance of when the developers need them. So they're essentially oven ready to purchase off the shelf for developers to use as they need. And this was just a little image here of one of our projects. It gives you a bit of a feel, real life feel for the transformation. So it's an arable reversion project. It's not particularly huge. I think this one's about 15 hectares, and we're taking it back to species-rich grassland, some ponds, some traditional orchards being put back into the landscape, and some scrub. And I'll pass back to Aaron.
Thank you so much, Emma. It's great to see real life examples of biodiversity net gain, something that we've all heard so much about, but I don't think many of us have seen what it looks like in real life. So yeah, thank you so much for that. We'll now hear from Poppy Shearborn. So Poppy, as Countryside Advisor at the NFU, could you outline other possible mechanisms farmers have access to when considering supporting biodiversity within the landscapes in which they manage?
Of course. Thank you very much, Aaron. Really pleased to be here today. So obviously we've spoken a bit about biodiversity net gain so far, but biodiversity funding isn't just limited to net gain. And as Emma's spoken about, and as Harvey will go on to talk about next, it might not be the right choice for your business, or it might be part of the choice for your business to restore or manage biodiversity on farm. So I'm just going to talk through some of the other ways in which you can fund biodiversity action on farm, and that could be anything. That could be in your soils, that could be in your hedges, it could be in any field options, it could be in your woodlands. So we're not just necessarily talking about operations that might change or move away from farming production, but those that can also work with it as well. And it's really important to try and find the ones that work for you.
Poppy, sorry to interrupt. We can see your notes as well in a minute.
Apologies, sorry.
It's all right, don't worry.
Let me see if I can change it the other way around.
Just while we have this short break, I just want to remind everyone to put their questions in the Q&A session or the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we can, after the next speaker, we can start answering some of your questions. But if you start to line them up, that would be absolutely fantastic. And sorry, I'll pass back to Poppy now.
Thank you very much, and sorry about that. So yes, I'm going to carry on talking about some of the funding actions for biodiversity on farm. So I've broadly split them up for this purpose of this webinar and presentation into the public funding, so principally talking about the environmental land management scheme, so that's your government funded opportunities. But I will also touch on other kind of private funding opportunities, including briefly BNG. There's a few kind of key things to note before I get into a bit more of the detail. Really important just to be aware, and others have mentioned this, that environmental markets more generally, so the private markets, are still evolving. So they're still in their early stages, and they will grow and evolve with time, and as will our learning and understanding of those. It's quite a new and can be quite a daunting space to be operating in because of that. Really important as well that funding can be stacked and combined. It also can't be, and there's certain scenarios that I'll go through where they can work in practice, but it doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be both, and actually both, potentially having public and private funding, can deliver the greatest outcomes for biodiversity. As part of that, it's important to really be aware that not all funding is the same in that capacity, and this comes on to some of those key things to consider when we're talking about the funding opportunities, and I'll go into that a bit further on in my presentation. So it's really important to understand those key things to consider, what's involved and what is best for your business. So briefly touching on the private finance aspects, obviously we've got the environmental markets, which are principally driven by compliance, and with the case of B&G, that is driven by the developments, so new buildings. But as part of that, you also have other compliance markets and other markets out there. So you also have carbon, and that could be stored in soil. It could be stored in your woodlands. We have the Woodland Carbon Code. We also have a hedge carbon code. So those funding mechanisms, those other private funding mechanisms, environmental markets, also support activities that can support biodiversity on farm. The other one to be aware of are those that support water. So that could be water quality, it could be water management, and one that hopefully some of you have heard of is nutrient neutrality. So similar to B&G, it works alongside development. So where development might need to offset any nutrient load, farms can be involved in helping to create credits, nutrient neutrality credits, to help provide that offset. So again, a few different market opportunities that are available. I've put other here to kind of capture quite a broad breadth of options, but there could be local charities in the area that are providing funding for particular habitat or species in your area. So they might provide some really specialist funding that's important to be aware of. And I've also put on here corporate social responsibility. So that could come directly through the supply chain, so requirements within your contracts or on farm, for example, or it could come independently through other ways as well. And I've just put at the bottom that because private funding are often quite new and they're quite different and quite long-term agreements, it's really important to think about attaining that advice you need. And Emma's touched on some of the ecological advice that you might need to seek, but also the kind of legal advice that's really important, so you understand what's involved in those longer term agreements and if it's right for your business. So in terms of those environmental markets, as I said, we know they are still evolving, and as they're evolving, the NFU and some of our policy work and lobbying work is working with the wider industry to ensure some key principles are upheld within those environmental markets as they develop. So really importantly, they've got to work alongside the production of food, energy and fibre. They've got to have clear kind of rules and standards around them to support them. Really important that farmers can access them as well. We don't want to make this something that's inaccessible for land managers, and that there is that fair reward in place as well. So moving on to some of the more public funding opportunities, and principally I'm going to talk about the environmental land management schemes, or ELMs, which will be one of the main routes to get public funding to support biodiversity actions on farm. Obviously, it's not just about biodiversity, but some of the outcomes can help with that. Obviously, a big diagram here. I'm going to focus on the 2024 year. So as part of that, you have the Sustainable Farming Incentive, or SFI. We now have the expanded offer, which is available for all to apply. And we also have more detail about those endorsed options that sit alongside the core Sustainable Farming Incentive. And this is meant to be an option or scheme that's available for those to integrate within their farming system to help farm more sustainably. We also have Countryside Stewardship Higher Tier. Yesterday, hence the big star, we had a further announcement about the higher tier offer and more detail about what will be available next year. So that is really to help some of the more, I suppose, environmentally ambitious areas achieve more for nature. And then separately to those two options, we also have landscape recovery, which is a bit more bespoke and more landscape scale, hence the name. And that can be actually a combination of both public and private funding as well. To support all of those, there are capital items which pay for revenue and upfront capital costs. So that could be your fencing, for example. Some of the capital items are currently closed, pending a review, but there are still some options currently available. Separately to the core ELMS offer, We also have the England Woodland Creation Offer, which will be merged eventually into the main ELMS schemes. It's currently operated separately at the moment. And there's also other funding opportunities that they've not directly put on here that the government do provide. So you have the Farming in Protected Landscapes programme, we have Countryside Stewardship Facilitation Fund, and we have other kind of grants around farming more generally as well. And this next kind of slide and diagram kind of highlights what those differences might kind of be for some of the private funding and some of the public funding that I've spoken about. And this is just to really demonstrate one of the things to think about and consider is just the agreement length. So your SFI options could be 3 to 5 years, higher tier might be 10 up to 20 years, but your kind of private finance agreements might be a lot longer. So we know that BNG has to be 30 years as a minimum. Nutrient mitigation credits can be, over 125 years. So they're very different agreements, what you're signing up for, and Emma's spoken about some of the risk involved. So it's just really important to be aware. And as you can see, I've colour coded them here. So the green ones are your public funding. So they are on the whole shorter term, whereas the kind of private finance can be longer term. And they also can be different about how they impact your business. Some of the longer term things actually lead to land use change, whereas SFI or some of the higher tier options can continue with your farming practice on those areas of the farm. So I'm just briefly going to touch on stacking, combining funding. So stacking is where you can have funding for multiple outcomes on the same area of land. Obviously, the government have put some guidance together on this because there could be quite a lot of complications and complexity involved in how this actually works in practice. So to summarise the guidance, I'm going to quickly say it's no double funding, because essentially you can't be paid to do the same action twice. And that is the principle that applies in most cases. And that's a really important one to kind of remember. I've put a bit more detail here on the slide. So when we're talking about nutrient neutrality and BNG, they can actually be stacked on the same piece of land. So that's an exception to that rule. If you were talking about maybe having BNG and SFI on the same piece of land, generally they can't be on the same piece of land to achieve the same outcome. If it was something like a capital grant where you might be paying to fence the area around your biodiversity net gain fields, that would be possible because you're not paying for the same outcome twice. And that kind of wraps up that discussion around the other funding opportunities. I've put the link here for more information about both BNG and ELMS, which is on the NFU webpage. But thank you very much, and passing back to Aaron.
Thank you so much, Poppy. I now feel like we have set the scene for on-farm biodiversity, biodiversity net gain, and methods to implement biodiversity net gain. But now also other mechanisms and incentives for restoring biodiversity on farm and carrying out farming practices that support and increase biodiversity. But deciding which opportunities are right for your farm business is a difficult decision to make. We'll now hear from Harvey Davies. Harvey, can you help outline how farmers can navigate which opportunities might be right for an individual farm?
Thanks, Aaron, and good afternoon, everyone. And yeah, this is an area of law that has been developing quite fast over the last few years, and it's been a particular interest to me as someone who farms up in Herefordshire, where a lot of these issues have been brought into sharp relief with the ongoing issues with the condition of the River Wye and all of the associated impacts that has had on both farming operations and developers alike. Before I get into the specific legal considerations around opportunities for restoring biodiversity, I'm just going to set out some of the legislative background to this whole area to start to understand, hopefully, some of the key legal drivers for these opportunities, and the flip side, some of the potential pitfalls awaiting farmers and land managers looking to enter these markets. As Poppy set out, there are actually quite a few ways of monetizing your project for restoring biodiversity. A lot of people do associate biodiversity net gain, obviously, with restoring biodiversity, but there are other emerging markets, and there will probably be new emerging markets as time rolls on. Historically, of course, land managers were traditionally reliant on government-led schemes, both when we were in the EU and outside of the EU with SFI more recently. But as the environmental agenda has developed, so has the interest in the capacity of these natural capital markets to obviously meet these ambitions. And I guess in the last Parliament with the last government, this was really set out. They set out quite an ambitious agenda in the form of the Environment Act 2021, which was a landmark piece of legislation. Now that set out initiated biodiversity net gain, and thankfully Nick has gone through that very succinctly, so I'm not going to repeat anything of what he said. I think it's also, though, worth emphasising that in the Environment Act, it imposes a requirement on government to set a whole raft of legally binding obligations in relation to things like biodiversity, water quality, and air quality. And just to give you a couple of examples, the government has now set targets for to restore and create more than 500,000 hectares of wildlife-rich habitat within a 20-year period starting from 2022. A target to reduce nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment pollution from agriculture into the water environment by at least 40% within the 20-year period starting 2018, and to increase the land area under tree cover by 2050 from 14.5% to 16.5%. So you can see that we've got the legislative and regulatory foundations, which is clearly driving a lot of the interest in this sector. And alongside the Environment Act, we also had the Conservation of Habitats and Species Regulations 2017, and a combination of European and UK court decisions and Natural England guidance, which gave rise to the phenomenon known as nutrient neutrality, and which, as Poppy indicated, that's what requires developers to mitigate the nutrient impacts of their development in order to be able to progress that development. These biodiversity is obviously relatively new. Nutrient neutrality has been around for a bit longer, but I think that the point that's really worth emphasizing at this stage is that this whole agenda is going to give rise to different markets, and it'll be important for you to really assess what is going to be the best avenue and approach for you to take. It might be that biodiversity net gain is not the best option. It may be the most obvious one, but it might not be the best one. In addition to that, there is got to be a cautionary tale, and that is in the context of nutrient neutrality, where just over a year ago, the government announced that it was going to scrap nutrient neutrality as a requirement. And that had a really chilling effect on the market. And I think that's an important point to underline. You're not being rewarded for your assiduousness as a custodian of the environment. You're being rewarded for the value of what you're offering. And that essentially, like any other market, is going to be determined by supply and demand. So it's really important to bear that in mind when you're considering all of this. And going back to nutrient neutrality, the government threatened it was going to scrap it. It had a chilling effect on the market. Developers thought that they were going to get away and not have to deal with this anymore. And so obviously lost interest in purchasing nutrient credits. Obviously, the government didn't get that through Parliament. It then became apparent that they weren't going to revisit the issue before the election. And since then, the nutrient market has been pretty strong. And we have done a lot of work and a lot of trades in this area. So that's been quite interesting. But nonetheless, it does highlight just how all of this stuff is born out of government policy and these legislative and regulatory frameworks. And when those get changed or tweaked, that is inevitably going to have an impact on the demand side and possibly the supply side. And that's something just to really just be very mindful of, I think, going forward. Now, when you're considering your own scheme back on farm, there are obviously a few things that you're going to need to consider. And I'm just going to, at the time that we've got, just going to tease out some of the issues that we've seen arise in practice. Now, with these markets, there are certain core underlying principles which kind of permeate this whole area. And I'm just going to go through a few of them now, and to help you understand how this stuff is going to impact on your land and your broader farming operation. So one of the key things is this idea of additionality, that you've got to deliver and generate a clear, genuine, measurable improvement over and above the existing land use. Now, in the context of biodiversity net gain, for example, it might be that if that land has already been part of a SFI or countryside stewardship scheme, it might be that the gain that you can generate on that land is more limited than in what it would be if it was on, say, a land that had been used, say, for purely arable purposes. But the fact that you've obviously got to go through this process to produce these schemes does entail some quite significant professional costs, as has been outlined earlier, as well as all of the ongoing management costs. And obviously that begs the question about thinking about more broadly about how you're going to consider the management of these schemes on the farming unit. And one of the things that I have noticed, and that has perhaps, I don't know why it has surprised me, but it has surprised me a little bit, is sometimes the sheer complexity of the ownership arrangements in relation to a farm. And these schemes are long-term. Often, though, you might have some owners are involved in the management of the business. They might be partners. Some of the owners are not, and they might have very different considerations as to what they want out of these projects. Some just might want cash, some upfront as quickly as possible. Some might want a steadier income stream, and those are certainly issues. What we found is that, particularly in light of, I guess, of the recent budget as well, is that there's going to be needs to be a lot more thought goes into sorting out the underlying ownership and management structures of the farming business before you really properly entertain these types of schemes. I think the other thing is as well is that if you're using these schemes or you're essentially looking to monetize them by selling the units or the credits into the wider market, just be aware, do you not need those credits or those units for yourself to meet obligations within the supply chain? It may be that you've got quite a big corporate customer and they might be soon expecting you, as part of their contract with you, to deliver certain environmental improvements. Once you've sold your environmental improvement, your biodiversity unit or your nutrient credit, you might find that in order to satisfy that contractual obligations in the supply chain, you're going to have to go and buy some yourself if you've sold all of the ones that you've got. Traceability and audit, very important aspects of these schemes. There's a lot of monitoring, a lot of administration and bureaucracy associated with them. All of the registration requirements in the context of biodiversity net gain, registering each allocation. There's various costs associated with that. Another key feature of these schemes, another key legal feature, is that these are long-term legally binding commitments. These are not just short-term 2-year countryside stewardship or SFI arrangements. These are at least 30 years by and large in the private markets of BNG, and nutrient neutrality can be 80+ years. These obligations that you enter into, which will be in the form of a Section 106 agreement with the local authority or a conservation covenant agreement with a responsible body, they will ultimately be holding you to account. And these agreements will contain obligations which bind not just you, but your land and all of your successors in title for the duration of the agreement. And it gives rise to the very real consideration about what impact is that having on the value of your land. And we've done a few schemes now where, interestingly, the valuation process as part of, say, an operator purchasing the land, that has been teased out that there is really can be quite a significant impact on the freehold value of the land, which is going to be the subject of these obligations. Secondly, what about your relationship with your bank? If you're in effect entering into arrangements which is going to have this effect of reducing the value of your land and therefore the value potentially of the security you have with the bank, that may ultimately constrain your ability to raise further finance from the bank to fund other parts of your farming operation. And also other property interest in the land, tenants. I mean, that's probably a whole topic all of its own. But inevitably, you're going to have to work with those other interests in the land. And obviously, these schemes can be done unilaterally. You can take the risk and run with them. So worth bearing in mind, as Emma highlighted, that obviously you've got operators like Environment Bank, and there are others, that you can enter these third-party arrangements. But these third-party arrangements can be quite complex. And again, in light of the budget, it may be you need to revisit the tax aspects of these arrangements to understand how that's going to play out in the longer term. And finally, really, is the issue of enforceability. Again, the responsible body under a conservation covenant and the local authority under a Section 106, have the ability to enforce these obligations and quite wide-ranging powers, the ability to step in and remedy any defects in the management of the land in accordance with the Habitat Management and Monitoring Plan, and recover the cost for doing that from you. They could get injunctive relief from the court. And associated with all of this, there's a lot of monitoring and monitoring fees. And those can be quite significant. So I've seen Section 106 agreements with at least £30,000 worth of monitoring fees, and conservation covenants can be significantly more than that. So obviously a lot to factor in there when you are dealing with the specifics of individual schemes. I just also add on the end that a lot of this area has been driven by what we call compliance markets, where the purchaser has to do this in order to be able to carry on the activities that they want to do. So developers with BNG and nutrient neutrality. But ultimately, we are seeing the rise of voluntary markets, which again, just to really remind you that there's going to be all sorts of innovations and new ways of approaching this area coming forward. So obviously important to do your due diligence, and when the time comes, obviously make sure that your agreements are going to do what you hope they think they're going to do. Aaron, back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Harvey. Thank you for covering quite a complicated and difficult area of this subject, and for making it clearer to understand. I know that the sort of legal side is definitely the more complicated thing to get your head around. So I'm now going to open this conversation to the floor and pass over some questions that have come in from people attending today. Just to highlight, this webinar is being recorded and can be revisited later. I know that for myself, that is definitely needed. You guys have done an absolutely fantastic job at covering a subject of which I know a lot of landowners are find it hard to get their heads around. So the first question that has kind of come in that might tick off a couple of other questions that I've seen down the list is I've kind of rewritten it to cover a couple of others. So because we've got quite a few questions coming in, it seems. So much farmland has already got a value for biodiversity, especially areas of permanent pasture and areas with large hedgerows. Can these land areas also benefit from biodiversity net gain, or are they more suited to other opportunities such as agri-environment schemes? So I guess that one I'll put out to the floor. Yeah.
I'm happy to go first. So it's all about additionality, as Harvey brilliantly touched on. So you want to try and maximize outcomes for nature. So obviously, in the most basic form, if you're starting off with a really low level of biodiversity, then you've got the greatest opportunity for uplift there. But it's really important to remember you only have a defined time frame. So you have 30 years in order to deliver an uplift in biodiversity. So for us, actually, arable reversion with very, very high phosphates in the soil, for example, is actually quite hard for us to get anything beyond a fairly moderate species-rich grassland. Now, that is a good outcome for nature, but if you've got an existing grassland or land that's sort of benefited from some level of enhancement already, you might be able to deliver a much higher species-rich grassland or lowland meadow. It also comes down to thinking about sort of unit values, and I think this was in the questions as well. So you might have a lower yield of units, but the unit types that you're able to deliver, you can sell them for more. So in the round, the revenue is either the same or it can vary significantly. So it's quite hard to put sort of blanket rules on this, I would say. I'd say there's often enhancing existing habitats can be the lowest input costs. You might not have to put lots of capital works in to establish those habitats in the first place, but you actually might be able to generate a nice uplift in biodiversity simply by stopping what you're doing currently or changing the way you manage things. So I'm always reluctant to have blanket rules. Where a site's at, a triple SI level and has been managed for nature for hundreds of years, then yes, probably the opportunity for uplift is limited, but there's always usually some level of opportunity there. I don't know, Nick, if you want to add anything, would you?
I mean, I would broadly agree. I mean, there are definitely kind of estates out there who've essentially bet the entire farm on B&G and have got and good luck to them on that. I mean, I do think there's the question around what's your existing level of habitat, and Emma's points in terms of how easy that is to get to gain from it. But also just to kind of reinforce some of what Harvey was saying, that this is a market as well, and you still need to find a buyer, and that's not guaranteed either. So I would also be thinking it depends on a landowner's appetite for risk. I think you've got areas of farmland or areas of land that are not that productive and not great quality for in terms of biodiversity. They're probably the best areas to focus on, because then you've got a greater opportunity for uplift, and you're not kind of going to be solely reliant, or you're not sort of, predicating everything on getting an income from something which you still need to find a buyer for as well. So, so be thinking about what type of habitats you've got, but also be thinking about what type of habitats you create or enhance as well, because there are some rules that developers themselves will be bound into around what they can buy to meet their own needs. And so having an understanding of where development is happening locally and what habitats it's impacting is really helpful, because that again will give you a sense of actually there's likely to be more need for this particular type of habitat than that particular type of habitat. And if you've got land that's suitable for the habitat that's in demand, you may find it easier to find a buyer.
Thanks, Nick. And Poppy, as a representative of the NFU, what's your perspective on, for example, land that has quite a high cultural value, such as thick hedgerows, permanent pasture, grassland in like less favourable areas, and if those land, do you see them having more of a value in agri-environment schemes?
I think it comes back down to what others have said in terms of, I suppose, what you're trying to do in your wider business. If the options and the risks and those considerations are right for your business. For some people, going down the route of using the agri-environment schemes, they might be more familiar with, there's less risks involved. They might have already been doing and managing their hedgerows, for example, in a really biodiverse way. So they might choose to continue what they're doing, and actually the agri-environment schemes might just provide the maintenance support to continue that way. Equally, if you wanted to maybe change how you're doing something, B&G could be a consideration, and I would encourage, the metric is a big spreadsheet, but actually anyone can go in and have a play around with it. So if you have got a particular habitat that you've got in mind, wherever the farm that you've got in mind, you can play, particularly the small sites metric, you can play around with that and enter what you've got, what you think you've got, and what you're hoping to potentially create, and just have a look roughly at kind of units you might create. And going back to kind of Nick's point, what is that demand in the area, what those unit values might be. So certainly something that you could start exploring yourself, even if eventually you might need to then bring in professional advice to maybe do your baselining of your kind of habitats, because that's what's really important, is understanding what you've already got before you're then considering any additionality or selling credits or units or entering into schemes.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And then I guess building off that, a question specifically on our habitats interchangeable. So Emma, could you just maybe make it highlight whether, for example, if you did have an area of permanent pasture or just an area of like rye grassland, and a developer developed on that land area, and that land area, that biodiversity value was lost, could that be interchanged by someone establishing an orchard or a woodland or something along those lines?
Yeah, sure. So the brilliant biodiversity metric that we have, within that is built in a number of trading rules. So in simplest terms, a developer needs to compensate for losses on either a like-for-like basis, or they can trade up only. So they can't trade down in terms, and when I say up, if you could imagine, you could list every type of habitat that we have in England with the most valued, most important, most distinctive habitats at the top, and the more common, the least distinctive habitats at the bottom, and then they were all in a list. If you think about it that way, a developer can only trade at their level or above. And the way the habitats are categorized is that they're essentially put into categories of distinctiveness and condition. And it's those are the things that the developer needs to meet the trading rules for. So it's not possible to, for example, remove a really species ancient meadow, species-rich grassland, and replace it with hectares and hectares of football pitches. You couldn't do that.
Yeah, brilliant. Harvey, on more the legal side, how do land areas under a biodiversity net gain scheme, how do they impact on things very topical for the moment, like inheritance tax? And what happens if at the end of the 30-year period, the overall effect has not actually been of the intended position? Oh, sorry, Harvey, you're on mute.
Great, that's right. Yeah, interesting. I think the next RASE talk, my colleague is from our private client team will be talking about some of the tax stuff. But I mean, ultimately, I think there's still a pretty open question as to how these various different schemes will be computed for inheritance tax purposes. And obviously, if it does fall within sort of the BPR or APR in terms of the release you might be able to get from inheritance tax, then you still got all of the current issues around, well, if you go above the £1 million, and is that going to trigger then a particular tax consideration? I can't really comment on much more further detail on the tax aspects, but interestingly, like I said earlier, is that one of the aspects of this is that potentially the freehold value of the land has diminished. So, that is going to insulate you to a certain extent from the tax, the IHT aspects of that land. But of course, it's worth bearing in mind, and this is a really important thing, is what is the tax treatment of the proceeds of the sale of those units or credits going to be? And there's a lot of chat between various accountants as to whether you can get it as capital gains or whether it should be treated as income. So I think, on the tax side, there is definitely a lot of things to consider, and getting tax advice is definitely critical. And I'd also just re-emphasize the point I made earlier about sometimes the arrangements related to the ownership of a farm are pretty complex, and very often these schemes could catalyze the need to revisit those arrangements and get them fit for purpose.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, thank you so much. And yeah, I mean, these are difficult topics that we're covering, and obviously there's a lot of change happening at the moment as well. So yeah, I massively appreciate you guys' transparency and participation on that. Nick, have you've got something?
Yeah, can I add on to what Harvey was saying as well, just in terms of the kind of essentially the liability and for the agreement if the outcome doesn't get delivered. I mean, a good legal agreement should set out quite clearly in it kind of what happens if you don't deliver an outcome as well. So so firstly, make sure that you've kind of that's been well negotiated. It would be in Natural England's view unreasonable for a landowner to be kind of penalised if they'd managed to the best of their abilities, but a circumstance totally outside of their control had occurred. Yeah, kind of act of God type of scenario. Their land is now part of the sea. Next door caught fire, and as a consequence, action was taken against that landowner. But there are also insurance products starting to come through as well. So just without wishing to further add to complexity, it may also be worth having a think about actually to what extent do you want to insure yourself against some particular circumstances as well. But the legal agreement should be quite explicit around what happens and what's expected of you.
I think the legal agreements are explicit, but there's a lot of scope for looking at the force majeure clause. And I think is an area that's probably going to be quite ripe for legal development, because there are various things that could happen, and what are the consequences that will flow from that event. So I think that's very much a live consideration at the moment.
Okay, yeah, I think I take from both what you both said is just make sure that you clearly understand the details whilst they're being written at the early stages, and definitely have legal advice when getting that reviewed. So a question here more to do with sustainable farming incentive and going away a little bit from biodiversity net gain. So maybe I'll direct this one more towards Poppy. And I was speaking to a farmer yesterday at the Royal Agricultural University about this very subject, about flood plain management. And obviously there are larger and larger areas in the UK being inundated with stagnant water and water saturation over long periods of time due to this prolonged increase in precipitation that we've been experiencing over the last 18 months. But what options do farmers have when they may have up to, when they have hundreds of acres under floodplain or water saturation? what SFI options are there for them? I know that some farmers are putting it under so winter cover with cover crops, but this may be positively or negatively impacting that land area, even though because it's underwater, because those crops are tending to fail due to the saturation. So, what options could a farmer consider if they are inundated with a large amount of water on their land area? And do you know if the floodplain management options are going to be coming out soon, or should they focus on available options at the moment?
Yeah, so I'll start with the positive news, rather than picking up on the kind of huge amount of obviously flooding and water we've had around this year, but also other years. We had the announcement of Countryside Stewardship higher tier yesterday, so that provided more detail on what options will be available come next year. And in there are options for floodplain meadows. So certainly worth having a read about what's required in that option and exploring that further. If you are particularly thinking about any meadows that are next to or in floodplains. So that's one to be aware of. And then I suppose as part of the wider SFI options, it's whether there could be options that help, I suppose, with management of water on your farm more generally, rather than necessarily options to cope with the water. So looking at where you might improve kind of soil health or soil structure, where you might put buffers in place to help the direction of water. Obviously, you can't help it if you are completely underwater entirely, but if there's better ways to manage water moving through the land, through the soil more generally, then certainly have a look at SFI. But if you're looking for specific options where you've got those meadows, for example, then Countryside Stewardship might be another option. But you also do have some private options there as well. So the ELM schemes aren't the only options there. We do know kind of water companies, for example, might come into agreements with landowners around rivers to do various actions to improve quality, to manage the water flow. So again, worth exploring what might be going on in your area as well.
Okay, that's yeah, good to know. And whilst I've got you on and speaking, there's another question that kind of looks more into capital works and so I guess specifically as part of developing biodiversity as a biodiversity net gain agreement, but also I think it would be useful for people to know outside of the agreement as well, other capital works due to various changes, like not being able to access capital grants at the moment, can they be paid by other private funding? So I guess there's two questions here. So one, as part of a BNG agreement, can capital works be paid by other public and private funding? And outside of biodiversity net gain, what are the best available capital work options now that the grants are kind of no longer accessible for this temporary period?
Yeah, so in terms of using capital items to support biodiversity net gain, obviously it would only be certain capital items that may be of interest, so fencing being potentially the prominent one. So by all means, it is possible to kind of use the capital grants to fence an area where you might be doing biodiversity net gain on that. So say it's a meadow, for example, you might be able to fence around the meadow. It's what you couldn't do is enter an agreement for Countryside Stewardship higher tier to enhance your grassland and also do that through BNG. That wouldn't be possible. So certainly you can fence around. So that would be something you could look at doing. Obviously, as you said, the capital items are currently under review. So this obviously came about as quite of a shock to many of us. And obviously we know earlier in the year we had the capital item payment rate increases, in which as part of that the cap was also removed. And then as a result, obviously there's been a huge amount of popularity in the capital items, and government have seen quite a lot of interest in them. So they have had to put some of them on hold. So it's the core capital grant offer that's on hold, so not everything. So there is still some options you can still access, but fencing, for example, would be one of the ones that is currently on hold pending this review. So obviously we would like to see that review happen as quickly as possible, because as you know, most fencing is probably done over the winter months, so it's going to have a huge impact on those people who are planning to do the fencing, and we're using that as part of their agricultural transition, but also wider environmental management on the farm as well. So in terms of kind of private funding, it might be something that's included within your agreement or is covered in the costs. But more generally, it would be that you would obviously have to pay the upfront costs, which is the case with any of the capital items anyway. You do always have to pay those upfront costs of putting the work in. But whether your costs that you then would get, say for B&G, would cover any capital works you need to do, that's something to think about when you are going into any of those longer term agreements. Is if any additional work needs to be done, does the cost involved in B&G and the benefits and the profits I might get help me do other things as well to help deliver it?
Thank you. That's really like you're all like very good at making quite complicated things very digestible, and I really appreciate it. And yeah, so I think going on to another really important question, which I think I'll hand over to Nick. It's so a question about tenant farmers. How does Biodiversity Net Gain work with tenant farming? And for example, if you had a multi-generation farming tenancy, would you be able to consider biodiversity net gain? And could farmers work with landowners so that you can get a shared payment?
Thanks, Aaron. And Harvey may want to comment on this as well. But so essentially for B&G, you, in order to get the land onto the register, you've got to be in a position to actually have the rights to kind of influence and implement what you're proposing for that 30-year period. So to some extent, it depends on the duration of your tenancy. It depends on the view of your landowner. It's not a no, but it depends on what type of tenancy agreement you've got. Harvey or Emma, I don't know if you want to add any more to that.
Well, I think, I mean, I would say it's ultimately going to be a matter for the terms of the tenancy as to how that relationship plays out. I mean, ordinarily, you take a Section 106 agreement, for example, the local authority would be expect, every relevant legal interest in that land to be bound. So, obviously, it doesn't want a scenario where the land's being entered into this scheme, but there's someone like a tenant who's actively occupying it and then obviously can do what they want. But in terms of, I think more relevantly is that relationship between the landlord and the tenant, and that really is a matter for the lease itself and what's set out in there as regards how how the scheme might be transacted.
Yeah. So it's more about the tenancy contract itself and what's written within that contract than I guess what the question on the chat might be alluding to is those kind of more historic tenancies. Do you see them being the multi-generation tenancies that we don't see so common now? Would they fit into that category of fitting?
I could just give an example. So we in the main, we don't purchase land. We take a long-term farm business tenancy out on all of our projects. The reason our projects are compliant is because we are of the length of the term of that tenancy. So and all of ours are for at least 33 years up to 36 years, which gives us a 3 to 6 year mobilisation period, a bit of a buffer. But in order to get on the gain site register and be compliant for B&G, we have to have a legal interest in the land that's unwaivable. It's concrete. You can't break it. You can't run off anywhere and do anything else. And you're bound to the land for 30 years. And so if your tenancy, for existing tenants, if their tenancy is less than 30 years, then that's obviously more challenging. If it's more than 30 years, your quids in kind of thing. There are different models. So, for example, under our model, we can subtenant out on if we have the primary FBT for 36 years, then we can subtenant under that and all the land management activities. So that helps to involve tenants in and to Harvey's point, you can have these legal agreements where the landowner is or isn't a signatory, where the tenant is or isn't a signatory, and that just depends on this sort of complexity of who's doing what and for how long.
Okay, thank you. And I guess, Emma, sticking on using examples to answer some of these questions, how do you have any examples of how biodiversity net gain payments can compare to productive farmland? So, for example, if you had an arable land area which is producing, let's say, 8 tons of winter wheat at milling quality, might have a value of about £1,500 turnover. How does that compare over that like long-term payment?
Yeah, sure. So I can talk openly about our model. So under our model, Environment Bank pay for all the capital works, all the infrastructure costs like fencing, water infrastructure for grazing, and then we pay our landowners and land managers about £1,000 per hectare per year. That's combined rental and land management fee essentially, and plus we cover all of the costs. We also cover all the legal costs, and we contribute to tax advice. So I know that for some of our landowners where they have marginal land, flooding's a brilliant example that Poppy pulled up earlier, where they are struggling to make them viable. We also take a lot of drought-ridden land. This is the beauty of ecology. It likes the marginal land that's not very good for food production. So the numbers stack up there really nicely. On other land which are thriving in terms of food production, the numbers don't stack up as much, and this is where it comes down to what's right for each landowner. But it gives you a bit of a feel for what a low risk, and that's guaranteed every year for the full 33-year term. It gives you a bit of a feel for what a low risk arrangement could look like.
Yeah, and Nick.
Just to add to what Emma was saying as well. So it to an extent depends on what habitats you're providing as well. So there's some habitats which are now already looking like they may well be quite well provided for in the market. So other neutral grassland there's quite a lot of it available. There are other habitats which are by their nature more challenging, perhaps require more unique circumstances for which availability is very limited. And so this is also quite new as well. So as a legal requirement, it only came in this year. So you could think that prices are probably higher now than they may be, say, in sort of 5 or 10 years' time, when there'll be potentially many more entrants in the market and prices will come down. But all the prices are driven through negotiation. I mean, you can go through the Environment Bank model, and essentially, they're doing a lot of the work for you and simplifying processes for you, and you get a kind of a set return, or as Emma said, you could opt to do this yourself. Potentially the rewards are higher, but then you've got you've got additional costs that you're looking to bear. So again, it is a negotiation. There isn't a set price on any of this at all, and you will get regional variances around and habitat by habitat variances.
If I could come in there, I think the really interesting element, which we really don't know yet, is on the demand side and how developers going to approach it. The extent to which they're going to try and do some of this stuff on site on their developments and not rely on the purchase of off-site units, or are they just going to rely on the purchase of off-site units? And it's interesting, isn't it? Because perhaps one would anticipate that grassland will be quite in demand because most greenfield development will be on grassland, and the mitigation hierarchy does require developers to avoid and minimize the impact on on habitats when they are putting together their planning application and their plans for the development. So, and ultimately being probably quite conscious of the cost associated with some of those more unique habitats, they may well try and steer clear of that and avoid being in a position where they're going to have to purchase it. So I think it's probably the great unknown at the moment as to how that's going to play out.
Poppy?
Thank you. I just wanted to kind of build on the cost model aspect, just to kind of touch on. I think there's been a few questions as well around actually that's for the 30 years potentially, but you are creating in most cases permanent land use change. So you wouldn't be able to go back to farming land at the end of the agreement. And I think that is something that needs to be considered as part of your costs that you get over those kind of 30 years, that there might not be potentially maintenance costs at the end. We don't know if elms will still be in existence at that point. So just worth bearing that in mind, because you will be creating some quite high valuable habitats and species that live in those habitats as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And actually the impact, I mean, the set of regulations called the EIA agriculture regulations, where the ability to intensify the use of that land for agricultural purposes is, you'd have to go and get specific consent from Natural England, and that could kick in quite early on in the piece, let alone 30 years. So it's definitely something to bear in mind, that, and as Poppy said, we don't know what the reward structure for that land might look like in 30 years' time.
And the other thing, just to complete that picture potentially as well, is that if your land is capable of further enhancements above and beyond what you contracted to sell, then you can sell again as well. So you can extend that 30-year period out, potentially by a couple of multiples of that into the future as well. So gradually take land and improve it over time as well through a series of sales.
Brilliant. I think on that note, and I think that was a really good and key summary of information or key point to make. And so on that, before with knowing there's a risk to open up another kind of jar of questions, I think it's probably a good time or good moment to end on. So just last but not least, I just want to thank you all so much for your time and your commitment to this webinar, for answering very difficult questions and for helping us navigate our way through this quite complicated subject. So thank you so much for joining today, and thank you to all the participants who joined us as well today. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.